My name is Bryce Rudick. I'm an adjunct professor of law at the New York University School of Law, and I direct the Guarini Center on Energy and Environment at the law school. I'd like to welcome you here on behalf of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. For the past 2 days, we've had 30 international and regional experts gathered together in a workshop sponsored by the Institute to talk about global climate finance. And tonight, in honor of Earth Day, we're going to have a discussion about climate change and the global response to climate change. To my right, we have Athena Ballesteros. She is the director of the International Financial Flows and Environment Program at the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C. She is also a technical and policy advisor to the Philippine delegation to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Next to Athena, we have Professor Gilbert Metcalf, who is a professor of economics at Tufts University. And in 2011-2012, he was on leave from Tufts and was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy and Environment at the Department of Treasury. And next to Gilbert, we have Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, who is the founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water in New Delhi. And Arunabha was very recently named Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. So they will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Okay.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Magandang gabi for those of you who could understand and speak Filipino. I will moderate this session, and my plan is to start the session by giving some introductory remarks, and then I will give Gib and Arunabha maybe 5-7 minutes each as well to give introductory remarks. And then we're going to be selfish for a while and have a little panel conversation between the three of us with 2 or 3 questions around the future of the climate change regime. And then hopefully save a good 30-40 minutes for Q&A at the end of the session. So I hope that sounds good to all of you. I thought I'd start by just sharing a little story. I'm from a country, the Philippines, which suffered tremendous devastation in 2009. I don't know if you heard of Typhoon Ketsana. The local name is Ondoy. And in September 2009, this tropical cyclone hit my country, one of the worst tropical cyclones that have hit the Philippines. And everybody in the country, whether you're there or abroad, knew someone or someone's family that was affected by the typhoon. It cost us about $1.09 billion in damages. About 800 people died almost 24 hours after the typhoon hit. Millions affected. My mom's and my mother-in-law's houses were affected. There was a UNFCCC negotiations in Bangkok happening at that time. So a lot of us had to fly over the weekend to either save your families or help clean up and attend to those in need. 80% of Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines, got affected and seriously flooded. And I was told that the water hit at about 20 feet. And I'm very short, so I feel like that's very high. And that's why you saw all those devastating images on TV about people dying and houses lost and millions of people displaced. And if you go to my country now, you will still see a lot of what they call tent cities where some of the families were relocated and haven't been able to go back to their homes. So with that example, it is clear that our efforts to curb climate change are becoming more and more urgent and vital every day. What used to be understood as a faraway problem of the future is now understood as a today. And local problems that has real impacts on people's lives, companies' bottom lines, and ecosystems around the world. If you heard of the recent World Bank report that was commissioned by President Kim, the science and the imperative is even more worrying. We in the NGO community have always said that in order to stop dangerous climate change and the devastating impacts of climate change, we need to keep global temperatures to below 2 degrees. Well, this new World Bank study done by the Potsdam Institute in Germany is saying that we are about to hit 4 degrees, and the impacts will be devastating for especially countries like the Philippines and most vulnerable countries. And a lot of things are happening in many countries. There are lots of countries that have taken national actions to curb climate change and promote low carbon policies. But climate change is a global problem that requires a global solution. And one of the things that many of us are engaged, I think, around this room is the global climate change negotiations. We don't want to use too many jargons tonight, but we want to introduce you to at least one, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or some of us would call UNFCCC negotiations. This is a process that involves more than 192 countries, a process that's been ongoing for more than 15 years that seeks to curb global warming and encourage countries to adopt policies and measures to reduce emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. So there's a turning point in this global negotiating process, which happened in Durban in South Africa in 2011, when countries decided that there will be a new binding agreement that raises the level of ambition in the post-2020 timeframe. The important thing here is that previous negotiations have focused on what developed countries, industrialized countries, have to do to reduce their emissions. But in Durban, a turning point is when there is some kind of an agreement. They are still in the process of shaping what that agreement could look like, that both developed industrialized countries and developing emerging countries, emerging economies, will have to act together because the problem is serious and we have to act soon. That process towards agreeing on the next stage of the future global climate regime has to start in 2015. So a lot of us in the civil society, environmental NGO community, not just in the US, in Europe, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, are very, very active in helping build the political momentum towards a strong next stage of the negotiating process, which has to begin in 2015. And if you look at what the science is telling us, we will have to curb emissions, and I know Gib is going to talk about it, deeper and deeper as the regime progresses, starting in 2015, by 2020, and by 2030. So I thought I'd start with that challenging but necessary imperative of how we get from where we are right now towards strengthening the future of the climate regime. So I'd like to give Gib first the opportunity to give his introductory remarks, and then we'll go to Arunabha.
Great. Well, thank you, Athena, and thank you all for coming out this evening. So I just wanted to step back a moment and just provide some historic context on the problem of climate change. This is a problem of growing concentrations of so-called greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and the most prevalent greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide. Obviously, carbon dioxide is a naturally occurring substance. We need it. It's important for plant life, but it's the issue of how much there is. And climate change manifests itself both as warming temperatures and more extreme weather. And certainly the example that Athena gave in the Philippines is one of a number of examples. And of course, the difficult issue is you never know that any individual climate event is associated with climate change. We never get that sort of clear connection, but the evidence certainly indicates that we see more severe weather, warming climate. But if we look at just a few numbers, if we look at historic concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, if you go back 500,000 years, and the evidence is there from taking samples from the ice in Antarctica, you see that CO2 concentrations have varied between, these are measured in parts per million, or ppm. So they vary between 190 and 290 parts per million, cycling slowly over the thousands and thousands of years. And these are correlated with temperature increases, with glaciation, and with warming periods. And so we sort of see a threshold that often gets used is the pre-industrial era, that sort of the peak was 280 parts per million. Well, we're currently at 390 parts per million, so we're well above the natural variability. And what is most alarming is the trajectory is one of increasing growth and rapid rise going through this century. So if you look at where we were today relative to just 50 years ago, we've already seen quite significant increase on the order of 80 parts per million to get us up to 390. I did a study with colleagues at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology that looked at where we would be at the end of the century if we don't do any climate policy. And the so-called business as usual trajectory gets us up to 850 parts per million, which is simply unprecedented. We just have no idea what the world would be like if we were to get to that stage. If you look at, there have been analyses done that scientists have sort of coalesced around the idea that we need to limit temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees Celsius. And various studies have been done that suggest that if we keep carbon concentrations to 450 parts per million, recall we're at 390 right now, then we have roughly a 50-50 chance of avoiding a 2 degree or higher increase in temperature. So we have our work cut out for us. In fact, if we were to simply turn a dial and turn off emissions right now, carbon concentrations in the atmosphere would continue to rise for a while just because there's so much inertia built into the system. So the need for action is quite urgent. I think we'll come back during the discussion. We can talk a bit about more detail on sort of what the U.S. has done and what the U.S. could do. But maybe I'll stop there and turn it over to Arunabha as sort of to indicate that we know the problem is there. We see the increase in carbon concentrations. The need for action is great, and that's what we'll spend this evening talking about.
Right.
Great. Good evening, everyone. I think one of the challenges we often face when we talk about climate change, the response to it, is that we tend to use a semi-private language of abbreviations and technicalities and jargon that we've promised not to get into in this evening's conversation. The downside of that is that we don't really know if we are only preaching to the converted or whether we understand the different ways in which people living in different parts of the world either understand the problem or feel the problem or think of the responses to it. So if we just ask, take a straw poll anywhere and you say, what does climate change mean to you? I think different narratives will emerge from a group like yours or anywhere else in the world. One narrative could be to question the science, that everything that Gib just mentioned, there are certainly not a very large number, but there are influential groups that try and question the science and say, therefore, the correlation between the rise of the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the correlation with rising temperatures is questionable, and so forth. That's one type of narrative, to deny the problem altogether. There's a second narrative that looks at accepting the science, but not doing anything about it. And I don't mean that as a negative comment. I mean it as a sense of helplessness, that this is such a big problem. We've been pumping so much CO2 in the atmosphere since the dawn of the industrial age that there's not much that as individuals we can do, or even as countries we might not have the wherewithal to deal with the problem. There is a third narrative as well, which says that, no, we have to do something, but someone else will do it. And that someone else is either some other country or some other technology, that there's a quick fix somewhere that will come out of left field and sort out the problem. So you recognize the problem, you recognize that something needs to be done, but you hope for the silver bullet to come and sort it for you. And then there's a fourth narrative which says, yes, we all have to do something. It's not just something that you pass on to others. But a lot of that is really only contingent on growing economies. So you grow your way out of the problem. You become richer, therefore you have more access to money, you have more access to technology, and so forth, and you save yourselves that way. Why do I narrate these potential ways in which one can get feedback? A couple of nights ago, when I got into Abu Dhabi, I was not getting sleep at night, and I switched on the television, and one of the channels was showing the movie Titanic. And I had obviously seen it 15 years ago, but I got stuck onto the screen because the scene that was on was very pertinent to the kind of conversation we are having. The scene was that the ship is already sinking, and there are people getting into the lifeboats. And some of the lifeboats are being lowered half empty. Some are denying access to people from the lower decks. So this Kate Winslet's mother says, "Oh, I hope they keep the first class people separate on the lifeboats from the second class or the third class people." And Kate Winslet says, "Mother, don't you see that there aren't enough lifeboats and half the people on the ship are going to die?" And her fiancé, the villain of the movie, says, "Well, at least not the better half." Now, why do I say this? It's because sometimes these narratives are put together in a way that you wonder that, if our country just had enough money, or if I was just rich enough, then it's someone else's problem. The problem is, just like the Titanic, you are all together on a sinking ship. Some of you might be able to save yourself in some small way or the other, just like Athena was describing the cyclone in the Philippines. The rich and the poor all get affected. So what do? It's not something you can pass on to someone else. It's not something that you can pass on to the future. You've got to start thinking what we can do collectively. So I think we need to begin to sequence our actions by what we need to do in the short term, what we could be doing in the medium term, and what the kind of longer term that we need to keep in mind. In the shorter term, you've got to recognize that there's still a large number of people in the world without access to electricity, without access to clean water, sanitation, housing, all of which will require energy, and often carbon-intensive energy. So the short term means you get onto cleaner versions of dirtier technologies, whether it's cleaner coal, whether it is efficiency measures, whether it is the use of natural gas as a substitute. But it's important also to recognize that those bridges to the medium term don't become trapped transitions. That if you start using natural gas because it emits less carbon into the atmosphere, that doesn't become the end goal. So it takes you into the medium term. What do you have to do in the medium term? That's where the massive use of renewable energy becomes significant. Renewable energy is already being deployed across the world, but it's not yet become central to the energy mix. And then you have the long-term problem, that despite everything we are doing, there's still so much carbon in the atmosphere that the temperatures will still rise. So what do you do then? Do you suck out the carbon out of the atmosphere? Do you figure out ways of not letting any carbon get into the atmosphere? Do you sequester it under the ground? These are costly, unproven, difficult technologies that we have to deal with, that no single country has a solution to right now. But unless we see that there's something we need to do right now, which takes us to the medium term, which then takes us to the longer term, we will keep thinking that either I deny the science, or I deny the need for action, or I think action will come from somewhere else, or that I'll just grow out of the problem. And that's not going to be enough.
Great. I was waiting for the scene when Leonardo DiCaprio shows up and says something about saving the world, but maybe we'll save that for later. So I want to follow up with two related questions. Clearly, Gib has painted the scientific picture Where do we need to go, Gib? And what needs to be done in order to curb emissions? And I want you to comment on the state of play of the global climate negotiations, because that is the global process that is trying to address this problem. And then maybe you could follow after Gib.
So I think we have parallel tracks moving both in the short, medium, and long term, as Arunabha is suggesting. Mm-hmm. We have one track in the climate negotiations, which is to move forward in this post-Durban environment towards a new agreement that will be is to be signed in 2015, with a new global agreement to go into force in 2020. That will clearly be a very challenging political exercise, and I suspect that one thing I discovered working in government is that climate negotiators are like my undergraduate students. They wait until the very last moment to do things. They're great at procrastinating. So I think we will see in the next couple of years very incremental movement, but we're going to be really waiting until 2015 to see what kind of global agreement will emerge. And clearly a key contention there is going to be the future of this historic divide between developed and developing countries, a divide that was put in place based on sort of where incomes were in 1990, but that has persisted to this day. This is this concept of that developed countries are responsible for all emission reductions and developing countries have no responsibility. I think moving forward, this is no longer tenable. China is now the leading emitter of carbon dioxide. The United States is certainly a close runner-up in second place. But if you look at where the growth in emissions China is growing at an annual rate of over 9%. India is growing at a rate of over 5%. Now, clearly, historic emissions came from developed countries. What's in the atmosphere now is the result of years and years of fossil fuel burning by developed countries. But the stock moving forward is more and more coming from developing countries, and we have to grapple with this on a global level. So this will be the challenge in the international arena. I think in the domestic arena, just speaking for the United States has to show leadership. It has to set a carbon price, whether it does it through a cap and trade system or through a carbon tax. It's simply, we're the richest country in the world. It's really up to us to take ownership of this problem, show some leadership, and establish a carbon price. We're doing things at the state level. We can talk a bit about that. But really, it's time for the federal government to act. And I'm hopeful that within the next few years, it won't happen this year, it won't happen in the next year, but in the next 5 to 7 years, I'm increasingly confident that the United States will act.
Thanks, Gib. And I want to go back a little later to what the U.S. is actually doing domestically in terms of both energy policies and clean air-related policies. Arunabha, Gib touched on a very thorny issue, which is, I think, an issue that is close to your heart, and that is equity in the global climate negotiations. But it's time to unravel this complicated issue. Obviously, keeping in mind that a lot of the countries, including your country, India, still has major development imperatives and has very serious economic development objectives that they want to meet in addition to climate objectives. So how do we get there, and what do you think needs to happen between now and 2015 and beyond 2015?
In fact, Athena, to me, and Gib mentioned that there are many different parallel tracks going on in the negotiations that have been going on for the last 20 years. But to me, there are three big questions that the negotiations have to answer. Number one, how do we deal with this problem of equity? Number two, will everything that we promise, if Philippines promises something and India promises something and the United States promises something, will it all add up to stop the ship from sinking? And number three, what does a promise count for? So if you think of this, I mean, everything else is details. So the big question is equity. And this is something that we are debating. How do we define equity? Should it be based on historical emissions? Should it be based on the fact that certain countries will be emitting a lot more in future? Should it be based on equity for individuals? So we all recognize that even in developing countries, there are some very rich people who have the lifestyles similar to those of the developed countries, and then there are very poor people who need access to the energy and the water and the food. There are questions of equity in terms of access to technology. So suppose you were able to come up with one or two of those silver bullets. Would that be deployed in a way to save the planet, but would it widen the technological gap between different countries, say in the use of renewable energy or other technologies? There are questions about equity in terms of access to finance, something on which during the workshop that we were all part of over the last 2 days, we had a lot of debate about what does access to finance mean? What would you use the money for? Would you use it to prevent emissions from getting into the atmosphere? Would you use it to adapt, to build the dikes that would stop the water from coming in, and so forth? None of this has been resolved yet because of the different narratives that I pointed out. So I think the only way to get around it is to constantly ask oneself, as a negotiator, as a representative of a country, as a citizen, whose problem are we trying to solve? And I don't want to be too rhetorical, but there is something that Gandhi kind of left as a talisman for Indians and the rest of the world, which was that whenever you think of any public policy problem, you think of the poorest man or the poorest woman you've ever met, ever come across, and you see whether your action solves that person's problem or not. Otherwise, it's your action is not good enough. It's kind of the Rawlsian approach as well, that imagine yourself to be in that situation. And the reason I use the analogy of the Titanic is that we have to, at some stage, imagine that all of us could be in a situation like this. We could be living in a mansion by the beach, and it could be hit by a storm surge. We could be living in a mansion by a forest, and it could be hit by a forest fire. So equity isn't something that you just have academic discussions on. It's something that we have to internalize. It's not about creating a communist state. It's about understanding that one could be in a situation where you don't have the resources to respond. And unless we create a global architecture that deals with that challenge, we will be kind of sidestepping the problem. But very quickly, the two other big questions for the negotiations. Will our respective promises add up to the problem? And there's this big debate going on in climate negotiations right now of top-down and bottom-up. What the top-down logic says is that this is a global atmosphere, and we've got to cap all global emissions at a certain level to keep temperatures to a certain level. So that's top-down. You've fixed a target, and everybody else has to kind of work backwards from there. And that process has not been very successful because those promises have not been kept. So there's a new narrative which says, let's all come figure out our own responses. China will have its own response. India will have its own response. Barbados will have its own response. The United States will have its own response. And we'll all come to the negotiating table and say, here's my response. And let's all sign together on it. That could get you a deal. But will each of those responses add up to that cap, or would our respective trajectories take us beyond the targets? And that brings us to the third big question, which is what does each of these promises account for? When I make a promise, if I don't sign on a contract, it can't be enforced against me. But that contract is still enforced against me because I'm still operating under a legal framework. Whether it's my own country's or if I'm in the United States, I'm bound by its laws. But when a country comes and says, I promise to do this, what's the basis on which we can hold that country to its promises? So these are three big questions. That how do you deal with these different ways of thinking about equity? How do we understand whether our individual actions will add up to the actions that are required globally? And then what is the value of the promise that we are making?
Great. That's a nice transition to specifically talking about what countries are already doing. One of the I think exciting things that we've been seeing over the last 5-7 years is a surge in national policies, national frameworks for climate change mitigation and action. WRI, as of our last count, I think have documented something like 60 national plans called nationally appropriate mitigation actions. And these are policies, legislation, measures that different countries, primarily developing countries, have either passed legislation around or developed policies around to address climate change in both reducing emissions on the mitigation side and making their economies and development plans resilient. But it doesn't yet add up because those countries are sort of the smaller and medium-sized countries. And really, in order to address this issue, the bigger players, as we call them in the process, will have to step up. So let's talk a little bit about what the US is doing currently, and then turn to you as well to speak about what are the emerging economies doing? What is India doing domestically? And also share a little bit what you know about what the European Union is doing and what China is doing.
Well, let me start, very briefly, we've seen considerable action in developed countries. The European Union has had a history of high taxation on motor fuels and other petroleum products, which has contributed to a whole development urban structure in Europe that is obviously benefits from being a small concentrated region, but that's been quite important. They were pioneers coming out of the Kyoto Agreement, Kyoto Protocol, in establishing a region-wide cap and trade system, which set limits on overall emissions from the member countries, from their covered sectors, the electric utility and industrial base. And that has been a remarkable experiment, and both in showing how a multinational carbon trading system could be established and could operate. Now, moving from an experiment to something that's actually leading to significant emission reductions and leading to providing the appropriate incentives that will bring private financiers to the table and say, yes, we want to be investing in wind farms in Europe or in solar projects. Cap and trade is a bit more mixed in its success. The European Union has been struggling with the fact that it set targets for emissions in the region that made sense when the economy was much stronger than it is now. But with the financial crisis and the ensuing recession, now we're finding that the cap is not particularly binding, and so the price of allowances in the European cap and trade system is down around €3 a ton. And the problem for that is that with very low prices on emissions, it doesn't send the appropriately strong signal to electric utilities to be investing in solar power or wind or otherwise making incentives in very long-lived technology that will help us reduce emissions. The United States, at the federal level, it had this run at setting national carbon pricing legislation, made it through the House of Representatives. It failed in the Senate. But actually, there's been quite a bit going on in the United States, both at the federal and subfederal level. While I was in Washington, the administration came to agreement with the auto industry to improve fuel economy standards so that we would be raising them by 2025 to over 54 miles a gallon from the current level of less than 30 miles a gallon. So dramatic improvements in fuel economy save oil, but they also reduce emissions quite significantly. You see we've had great success at the federal level using tax policy to incentivize investments in wind and solar power. And we've seen quite dramatic growth in wind power, particularly because of incentives that pay wind developers for every kilowatt hour of electricity they produce. So there's an incentive to build things that actually function. At the subfederal level, you have California moving forward with a cap and trade system. You have 29 states that have developed policies to support to put in place so-called renewable portfolio standards, which mandate that a certain percentage of electricity has to come from renewable sources. We see the Environmental Protection Agency moving forward with regulating carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act, and with the first step towards creating standards for new power plants, and then down the road moving potentially to putting controls on existing plants. We've also seen a real revolution, which we don't actually think of as being related to climate, but it is, and that's the revolution in unconventional natural gas through hydrofracking, which has absolutely transformed the energy landscape in the United States. The United States has gone from importing significant amounts of natural gas to now looking to export significant amounts of natural gas. We were building import terminals for liquefied natural gas to be buying natural gas from Qatar and other countries. Those terminals are now sitting empty. They are now trying to re-engineer them so that we can actually export natural gas. Why is this important? Well, natural gas has half the emissions of coal. What that means in the United States is we are no longer building coal-fired power plants, and we're shutting them down increasingly. So that's a great bridge step. It's not a long-term solution. As we think of what we need to do in the short, medium, and long term, the natural gas revolution is buying us time in the United States to get longer-term solutions. And these are going to involve, and we can come back and talk about this. We're going to need breakthroughs in carbon capture and sequestration. We're going to have to be talking at some point about how we should think at an international level about geoengineering. There are any number of issues that will take a long-term perspective, and natural gas helps us to buys us a little time to do that.
Great.
So what is India doing? There are two big pieces of where the Indian government, I don't represent the Indian government, but where the Indian government comes at this from. One is in the negotiations, the government's position is that India's per capita emissions of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases will not exceed the global average. Right now, India is about a quarter of the global average, and the global average is about 1/12 or something of the U.S. per capita emissions. But to do that, India has this other target, which is called the emissions intensity of GDP. Sorry for throwing jargon at you. It basically means for each rupee of GDP that you generate, how much emissions is needed to get to that. And India's commitment is to reduce that by 20 to 25% over the next decade and a half. Now, how do you get around to achieving a target like that? And again, you're going to hate me for this, but I'm going to introduce a little bit of mathematics, but I'll try and explain it. So if you think of emissions as EM, it's emissions of GDP. could be either emissions that come out of your energy mix or the energy that comes out of that is put into the GDP. So if you want to reduce the emissions in your energy mix, you focus on renewable energy. And if you want to reduce the energy that you use in your GDP, you focus on energy efficiency. So these are two big kind of strands of action that India is following. So on the renewable energy side, we have this one of the world's largest solar programs called the National Solar Mission, which has an aim to put in 20 gigawatts of solar grid-connected solar power by 2022. To give you a relative estimate, India's current grid-connected electricity capacity is 200 gigawatts. So essentially, the aim right now is the ambition is 10% of that the electricity will be coming from solar, but of course the overall energy pie will also expand. To do that, one of the best things that India has managed to do is drive down prices of grid-connected solar power significantly faster than almost anywhere else in the world. So the lowest bids that are coming in are at about 7 rupees. That's about 1/8 of a dollar per unit of electricity. That's the kind of price at which project developers are bidding for solar. So it's already becoming competitive against diesel, kerosene, et cetera, all the kinds of dirty fuels that's part of the energy mix. Wind is we already have more than 16 gigawatts of wind energy. The potential is about 100 gigawatts. Some estimates take us to about 600 gigawatts, but the realistic potential is about 100 gigawatts. On the efficiency side, we've introduced what is called the Perform, Achieve, and Trade Scheme, PAT scheme. And there, we've taken 8 industries and given them targets to improve their energy efficiency. And for each percentage point of improvement in energy efficiency, you get these certificates, the energy saving certificates, which you can then trade on a market. So if another industry is unable to meet its targets and you have some surplus certificates, you can sell. So you create a financial incentive to act. Then this is all to kind of mitigate the problem of climate change. But as I mentioned in my initial comments, you have to also deal with adaptation. That the climate is changing. There are poor people, there are vulnerable people. So you need to focus on water efficiency, particularly in agriculture, which takes up most of the water. So we have a target of improving water use efficiency in agriculture by 20%. There are a range of other things, but I think I'll stop for now.
Yeah.
And we can maybe take more.
Yeah, I have
questions.
1 or 2 more questions, but I do want to open it up. But before I open it up, because this is a direct follow-up, we've touched on one aspect of the global solution, which is the Framework Convention on Climate Change Negotiations. Surely there are other platforms out there and ways to bundle and aggregate sort of this bottom-up actions coming from countries. Can you two speak briefly about where do you see the other platforms and the other opportunities are, whether it's the MEF or the G20, maybe there are regional forums or other activities that are happening that most people are not aware of that could contribute to building up that political momentum for a more robust climate regime. Gib, do you want to start?
Sure. I think there are a number of these platforms that are quite helpful, and because they sort of focus on different aspects of the issue or bring different players into the mix. You have the Clean Energy Ministerial, which I think I'll let Arunabha has probably I think more experience with it, which is something that has come out of energy ministries to share technology, which I think is quite important. You have the G20, which has been engaged on climate change, which has value in that it is dealing with some of the largest economies in the world, but equally, if not more importantly, the G20 is a collection of finance ministers. And this may seem like a sort of an unusual point to raise, but most of the climate discussions take place with negotiators and participants who are involved with environment ministries or foreign affairs who don't have a great deal of experience with thinking about finance issues. So given the kinds of monies that will be required to deal with this problem, given the need to address some of the equity concerns that Arunabha has raised, finance is going to be critical. If we think that there are sort of, we need mitigation reductions, we need clarity in reporting and understanding of what actions people are taking, and we need finance to help this all occur. So the G20 is a forum that brings finance ministers together to focus on this issue. So I think that's one platform that's extremely important. The Major Economies Forum is a lot of overlap with the G20, but this also brings together large economies, but bringing them together to really, these are the, if you think about the problem of this global problem of emissions, it doesn't matter where a ton of emissions goes into the atmosphere, whether it's emitted in the United Arab Emirates or the United States, it contributes equally to this global problem. So bringing together the major economies who are the major emitters allows us in a smaller group to focus on the issue of climate change. I think is quite important. And there are clearly a number of regional forums that allow us to deal with sort of whether it's adaptation issues or mitigation, to sort of, we create this mosaic of lots of different approaches to addressing the problem, and these different platforms are particularly valuable.
Very good. Arunabha?
I think very briefly, as Gibbs mentioned, there are a range of different forums where you could be negotiating different parts of the climate change conundrum. You could be talking about technology at the Clean Energy Ministerial, you could be talking about finance at the G20, fossil fuel subsidies at the G20, and so forth. But I think underlying all of this is another narrative which kind of links back to what I was saying earlier, is this notion of green growth. You know, I've been coming to Abu Dhabi since 2009 every year. I think I skipped 2010, but since then I've been coming every year. And I make sure that I go to Masdar. It's kind of an annual pilgrimage I make to Masdar. Not because I think it is generally going to be, necessarily going to be zero carbon or not. I'm not qualified to comment. But it's, to me, what's very interesting is that an oil-based economy decides to put at least some of its money to at least test out technologies, business models, education facilities, etc., that target a different type of an economic model. In 2008, the Korean government, the previous president said, well, the last 60 years we had economic growth. The next 60 years we will have green growth. Last year at Rio in Brazil, all the world's governments and NGOs and private sector all came together to again kind of talk about a green economy and so forth. Now, there are different ways you can think about this. Either you see this as a new path forward, that all countries participate in a global supply chain of technological and business model innovation, etc. Or you could think, hang on, this could be just greenwash. And actually, you're only following mercantilist policies to sell your solar panels in another market or your wind turbines in another market. We don't know which way it will go. But I think a lot of these different forums will grapple with this challenge of these new pathways for economic development.
Great. The issue of green growth is an altogether big topic. Maybe the next event should focus on that question alone. We're now ready to engage with you guys.
What is the effect of the financial crisis on the global climate changes? We had 4 or 5 years with very slow economic growth, probably in China and the US, in Europe, most of the world. And Dr. Gibb probably mentioned that the carbon still will continue to rise. But is there any monitoring to this period of time? Because I remember, if everybody knows about in the United States, in the September 11th, when the airspace was closed, and I heard that there was some studies that some sort of global issues or some sort of weather phenomena have stopped to affect the United States. Can you just shed some light on this?
Okay, let me collect a few more questions and comments, guys.
What about the African countries? They're still developing and some do have oil. Are they in the negotiations as well?
Yes, you mentioned earlier about the EU and the ETS, and I've recently read a report from the Washington Post, and it's been pretty prevalent amongst a lot of the journals, periodicals, so forth, about what's happening with the vote in the EU and their failure to vote some sort of revision to the ETS. And they were talking about a carbon price where it's roughly around $9 right now for it to actually be effective to be roughly around 67 per ton, I believe. And I was wondering if you can comment a little bit about that. Aside from the need for emerging economies to involve in the dialogue, how would you comment on the EU's own inability to deal with their own cap and trade scheme now?
There is another very important principle in the convention and the protocol, besides the historical responsibility and equity and others. That is, the developed countries should take the lead in combating climate change. At least this, in a sense that they should fulfill their obligations, whether under the protocol or the convention, or stand up to the promises they make, whether pledges and others. And unfortunately, one of the recent studies by OPEC shows that, you see, developed countries are lacking behind, both in their fulfillment to their protocol commitments and their promises, and also, you see, there's some sort of inaction towards cool, because what we see and what we hear is that they are imposing taxes on oil products while not almost ignoring, you see, the coal, which is the most dangerous and far have a negative impact on climate change. Thank you very much.
With respect to the impact of the financial crisis, it has a there are sort of two sides of this coin. On the one hand, it has certainly contributed to a decline in emissions. The U.S. emissions are actually about 17% lower than they would be had we sort of stayed on the same trajectory of GDP growth, fuel intensity and carbon intensity, sort of pre-2007, pre-crisis. So we're 17% lower. Fully half of that is due to the slowdown in GDP. So there is this benefit, so to speak, that we get fewer emissions because of the recession. Now, is this a good way to reduce emissions? Clearly not. We want to. Economic growth is important both in developed and developing countries. So it's had this effect of slowing down emissions. It's also had the effect of, and this relates to the EU ETS, of reducing permit prices and reducing some of the finance flows that are important for helping to generate clean energy projects. So, for example, within the Kyoto Protocol, there is this thing called the Clean Development Mechanism, which is in developing countries who do clean energy projects can be paid for doing those, and the European Union has been a purchaser of the sort of emission savings from these Clean Development Mechanism projects that they can use to fulfill their obligations with the EU ETS. But when the EU ETS prices, when the emission trading prices in Europe fall to €3, then it completely undercuts the financial incentive to do these kinds of projects. Moreover, there has been a fund of money that's been collected through a tax on these Clean Development Mechanism projects that can be used to help fund adaptation projects in developing countries, and so that money dries up. So that's been a problem. It's also been very challenging for the in the U.S. to get a how do I say it politely, to get a hostile Republican Congress to support international climate aid. I would go up to Congress and try to get funding for international climate funds, and I run up into two problems. First is it's international, and the second is it's climate. So it's a challenge for us, and it's even more of a challenge during a recession. Now, with respect to the ETS, so the European Union saw that it had this problem, that because of the slowdown in the economy, the permit prices were quite low, and it was undercutting that financial signal to do clean energy investments. So the idea was to take 900 million permits, which represent 900 million tons of emissions, and to take them and say, okay, we'll take those permits, and instead of putting them into the system now, we'll hold them back for 5 or 7 years. We won't retire them, so we'll keep the cap, the cap over a long period fixed, but we'll just, it's called backloading. And so the idea is we'll take them out of circulation now, and that will help support the price. Now, the European Parliament met this past week, and in a very close vote, voted not to go along with removing these permits from circulation. And it was a very tough vote. I think there was no clear certainty as to whether the vote would succeed or not, but it caused a very sharp reduction in permit prices. The positive thing, if there's anything positive about this, is that they did say, instead of saying, you can't do it, we're done, stop talking about it, they said, European Council, go back and look at this more, and implicit in that is that they can come back to the Parliament with a new proposal. And I think there's some hope that Germany did not instruct its Parliament members with sufficient clarity, and I think there will be probably some political pressure put on the European Parliament members, and I would not be surprised if this vote is reconsidered in several months.
Okay. You want to tackle
I want to quickly answer the question on the financial crisis, and then come to your question about Africa, as well as the gentleman at the back who talked about unmet commitments. On the financial crisis, as Gib said, an economic downturn is not the most optimal way of having lower emissions. But there's another impact on how you invest in clean energy. So right from 2002, investments in clean energy or sustainable energy or renewable energy, however you define it, was on an upward curve, and it was continuously going up. And then there was a sharp drop. But guess when that sharp drop happened? It happened in the first quarter of 2008. When did Lehman Brothers collapse? In the third quarter of 2008. Why do I make this point? It's because when you think about investments in renewable energy or clean energy as a portfolio of your investments, if you have investments in mutual funds or you work in a pension fund, think of a portfolio investments. You invest in companies making t-shirts and shoes, companies making cars, and then companies making solar panels. But that's on the risky side of your investment portfolio. Your investment advisor will tell you, you know what, keep maybe 5% of your investment there, put 80% of your investment in making shoes. So when you see the first signs of crisis, you also exit those risky sectors. That's why the dip happens two quarters before Lehman Brothers collapses. And the upswing also takes a much longer time, right? So when I talked about renewable energy as kind of the medium-term strategy, that doesn't mean you save it for the medium term. You got to start doing work on it today so that over time it's no longer at one end of your portfolio curve. It becomes part of the new normal. It's bang in the center of your investments, right? So that's one big challenge. Now back to this point about unmet commitments, this issue of what is called common but differentiated responsibilities, that we have a common responsibility to save the planet, but we have a differentiated responsibility because some of us are more responsible for creating the problem than the others. And that goes to this point about are African countries at the table? Yes, they are. It raises question, should they be digging up oil and selling it in the oil markets? And the framing here is very important. When we say developing countries are going to be having a lot more emissions in future, whose emissions are they for? Is it because developing countries are themselves going to consume all of those carbon intensive products and services? Or is it because you've shifted manufacturing to cheaper bases, or you're sourcing oil and petroleum and gas from cheaper sources, but to continue funding our rich lifestyles? And if you think of it from a consumption point of view, then the story completely begins to change. So yes, they are at the table, but I think it's back to that equity issue of, are we looking at their aggregate emissions as a bad thing, or are we asking why are those emissions coming out, and whose lifestyles are we supporting?
This is regarding, actually we have discussed a lot about the country's contribution. Yes, I will stand up. Country's contribution in reducing the carbon emissions, but we didn't discuss anything about individual responsibility of the citizens in doing the same. And I feel that in countries where there are a lot of sunlight, we can promote solar panels at home, individual levels at subsidy-based methods. And that will promote more, and it make the result more faster than a country as itself focus on it, because a lot of capitalist involvement will come in such areas. But if an individual decides to do that, it makes a more of sense. I think the initiative should be in that line. What's your opinion about it?
Is there any group studying Plan B? In other words, if we do a good job mitigating and whatnot, but at the end of the day, 200 or 300 years down the road, we do in fact start seeing the consequences of global warming.
My question leads on from the gentleman in front of me. You mentioned a lot about taxation and how that seems to be a thing on national, international scales of looking at reducing people's emissions. It's quite a negative way of looking at people's personal responsibilities, and I wanted to know your thoughts on the role of education in sort of globally, and how that could help reduce emissions. I also think there's problems with contradicting narratives in the media, where you have climate skeptics that aren't really skeptics in the scientific sense, but from oil companies and funded in certain respects. There's also people saying that there's anthropogenic reasons for climate change, yet with absolutely no idea of the science. Of course, there's strong scientific evidence to say that this is the case, but I'd just like to know your thoughts on education and where that plays a role in reducing emissions.
Both of you mentioned the correlation between the carbon emissions and pre-industrial age. The same thing could be said with global population. What is being discussed with, how sustainable is global population? Where is the cap, I guess, or are we past it? Is the sky the limit?
Let me try and tackle some of these, and I'll take it in the order that it came up. The individual responsibilities, I completely agree. And I think the point here is not that we stop consuming, or that we give up living in the houses we live in, etc., but how we can make everything more sustainable. And this is what I meant as the new normal, that renewable energy, clean technologies is not one end of your portfolio, that you begin to change the light bulbs to CFL or LEDs, you rethink whether you want an SUV versus a more fuel efficient car, and so forth. But let me just reflect on a particular example that I was covering several hundred kilometers in rural India, trying to understand business models for higher deployment of renewable energy. You would think that these would be places where people would be so poor that they have to be subsidized to kind of use cleaner technologies. And I came across inside a forest in rural southern India, a farm laborer who lives in a thatched house. The hut is inside the forest, so he does not own the plot of land that he's sitting on. He's too weak to go and work in the farms, so there's limited income. But all his 3 daughters are in school. One of them has become a nurse, etc. And this man in the middle of this forest has a solar panel on his house. So I'm sitting there scratching my head, thinking, I don't have a solar panel on top of my house or on top of my building because the building developer didn't install it. How does this guy manage to do it? And I asked him, what got you to take on a loan of about $400 to install that solar panel? And he comes up with an answer that I can bet no renewable energy company, kind of chief financial officer would have modeled into their business model. It says, in southern India, there's a tradition of wearing crisp white shirts. No matter how poor you are, you're always clothed in crisp white shirts. And he says that before this solar panel was installed, I was using kerosene, and kerosene emits fumes. So I was spending 50 rupees a month, that's $1 a month, on detergent powder to clean my dirty white shirts and make them clean. After I installed the solar panel, I am spending 20 rupees a month, 40 cents rather than $1 a month on detergent powder. Now, I can bet no financial officer would have modeled in their thinking about where can I get a customer to buy a panel on a loan, etc. They would have thought about subsidies, all sorts of things. They would not have thought about detergent powder expenses of a farmless, landless laborer. And this is what I mean by the new normal. This is what I mean by individual action. It is well within our means to start changing our lifestyles if only we were willing to think, and that goes to that education point as well, and it goes to the global population point as well. I'm not a Malthusian. I don't know whether there is a cap on a global population, but I think it is an important question we have to ask, is that whether my daughter is 6 months old, being born into the middle class, will consume a lot more than even 4 children of a very poor person. So it's the sustainability of our lifestyles that has to be the question that we pose before ourselves.
I think that's quite well put. And we do see people in many countries showing clear desire to live in a more sustainable way. I think an analog of the crisp white shirt in India is air pollution in Beijing, where moving away from coal is not just a climate change issue, it is a local air pollution issue. I think you had mentioned this around the closing of airports around 9/11, that we saw a perceptible local benefit. I think there are lots of co-benefits that people are recognizing and taking advantage of. I think education is extraordinarily important, and I think we don't do enough of it. There have been any number of very innovative education programs to help people understand, well, what are the costs of this appliance that I'm thinking about buying, and is it really worthwhile to spend $15 or $20 or $50 more for a more energy efficient appliance? So there are lots of very inexpensive interventions to provide education that help people make better informed decisions, and can help with the issue of sort of being a well-informed consumer of information and being able to sort of parse what is a legitimate climate skeptic from someone who has a particular line that they're following. But I do think that financial incentives matter a lot. And whether you see it in the fact that kerosene has a negative impact that gets folded into the decision to put a solar panel on a home, or whether it affects your choice of an automobile. financial incentives matter a great deal, and that's why I think carbon pricing is extraordinarily important. On population, I think technology and sort of urban planning, I think there's a lot of I'm certainly not a Malthusian. I'm really quite an optimist in terms of our capacity to feed and create space for people on this planet. But it does create a challenge in that it makes the costs of hurricane damage or cyclone damage or any extreme weather that much more costly if we don't do smart planning. So if we allow people to build and live on the seashore, if we eliminate mangrove regions that provide a natural buffer, then we create real costs and real damages that just magnify the impact of climate change. And so we sort of shoot ourselves in the foot. So I think combining smart planning with incentives help us a long way, both to reducing the effects, creating more climate resilience, as well as helping us to mitigate the emissions along the way.
Great. And I think as a way to end, I want to take up that question of Plan B, which is obviously a scary question, especially for a mother of 3 very small children. But what's happening in many of our countries, the Philippines has just been ranked one of the top 3 most vulnerable countries in the whole world, vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But what is interesting is in many of the countries, because countries are feeling the effects of what used to be the future, which is the now, and that is climate change, that there is a serious conversation about reorienting development plans and how we produce and consume energy in our countries, how we build infrastructure, how we meet energy demands in our countries. And there's a very strong conversation about making infrastructure and energy infrastructure in particular climate resilient and making sure that the roads and the highways that we bridge, if we have to build them, take climate change and risks into account. And I think part of our collective responsibility as individual citizens and consumers is to make sure that we help create the political momentum such that the future climate regime will be fair, equitable, and robust. If governments do not feel pressure from citizens like you and me, it will continue to be business as usual. If industries and corporations and governments do not see movements and coalitions being built around these issues and calls for low carbon and resilient economies, then it will be business as usual. So I would like to close on that note and thank my distinguished friends and panelists and all of you for attending today.